This human baby grew with bear cubs. What the mother bear did was shocking. Let us know where you're watching from. If you love my content, consider supporting it with a super thanks. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe. It'll help us to remain in touch with amazing people like you. The morning mist clung to the forest floor like a whisper of secrets yet to be told. In the small mountain town of Pine Ridge, where houses stood scattered like forgotten memories among towering evergreens, something extraordinary was about to unfold. The kind of story that would make people question everything they thought they knew about the wild heart of nature. Maya Chen had always been different from other babies. At 18 months old, she possessed an unusual stillness that seemed to draw creatures from the forest to her family's cabin. Birds would perch on her windowsill, watching her with curious eyes, and even the neighborhood cats would abandon their usual aloofness to curl up beside her stroller. But nothing could have prepared her parents, David and Sarah Chen, for what was about to happen on this particular September morning. The Chen family had moved to Pine Ridge 6 months ago, seeking a quieter life after the chaos of city living. David worked as a remote software developer, while Sarah painted landscapes that captured the raw beauty of their mountain home. They had chosen this isolated cabin specifically for its proximity to untouched wilderness, never imagining that the forest would choose them in return. On this morning, Sarah was in her makeshift studio, brush poised over canvas as she tried to capture the way sunlight filtered through the pine needles. The baby monitor crackled softly beside her, carrying the gentle sounds of Maya's morning babble from the nursery. David had left early for a supply run to town, promising to return by noon with groceries and art supplies. What Sarah didn't know was that Maya had discovered something fascinating. The curious toddler had somehow managed to push open the screen door leading to the back porch, her tiny fingers surprisingly adept at manipulating the simple latch. The cool mountain air beckoned to her with its promise of adventure, and Maya, drawn by an instinct she couldn't understand, took her first steps into the wild. The forest seemed to part before her like a green curtain, welcoming her into its ancient embrace. Maya's small feet found purchase on the soft earth, her balance surprisingly steady as she navigated fallen branches and moss-covered stones. She moved with the confidence of someone who belonged here, as if the forest itself was guiding her steps deeper into its heart. 20 yards from the cabin, where the trees grew thicker and the shadows danced with morning light, Maya heard something that made her stop. A soft whimpering sound, almost like crying, but different from any human voice she had ever heard. Her head tilted to one side, the way babies do when they encounter something new and wonderful, and she followed the sound with the determination of a child on a mission. The whimpering grew louder as Maya approached a small clearing where wildflowers pushed through the forest floor in defiant splashes of color. There, partially hidden behind a fallen log, she saw them. 3 small, furry creatures, no bigger than puppies, tumbling over each other in what appeared to be distress. Their mother was nowhere to be seen, and they called out with tiny voices that tugged at something deep in Maya's chest. Maya had never seen bear cubs before, but she felt no fear. Instead, she felt a pulling sensation, as if invisible threads connected her heart to theirs. She approached slowly, her small hands outstretched, making soft cooing sounds that she had never made before. The cubs stopped their crying and turned toward her, their dark eyes wide with curiosity. What happened next would have amazed any wildlife expert. The cubs, instead of running or showing fear, moved toward Maya with the same careful curiosity she showed them. The largest of the 3, a female with a distinctive white patch on her chest, reached Maya first. She sniffed the air around the human baby, her tiny nose working to understand this strange new scent. Maya giggled, a sound like silver bells in the morning air, and reached out to touch the cub's fur. It was soft and warm, and the cub didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into Maya's touch, making a small rumbling sound that was part purr, part contentment. The other two cubs, emboldened by their sister's acceptance, crowded closer, and soon Maya was surrounded by 3 bear cubs who seemed as fascinated by her as she was by them. Time seemed to slow in that clearing. Maya and the cubs existed in a bubble of perfect understanding, where species and instinct mattered less than the simple joy of new friendship. They played with the innocent abandon of children, chasing butterflies and tumbling in the soft grass. Maya's laughter mixed with the cubs' playful grunts, creating a symphony that the forest had never heard before. But they were not alone. From the shadows at the edge of the clearing, a pair of amber eyes watched every movement. The mother bear had returned from her morning hunt to find her cubs in the company of something that should have triggered every protective instinct she possessed. Yet something held her back, something she couldn't understand. The human baby radiated no threat, no fear, only a warmth that seemed to embrace her cubs like sunlight. The mother bear, whom the local rangers had named Coda for the distinctive scar across her left shoulder, had lived in these mountains for 8 years. She had raised 3 previous litters and had learned to read the intentions of every creature that crossed her path. But Maya was different. The baby's scent carried no aggression, no predatory instinct. Instead, it held something that reminded Coda of her own cubs: innocence, vulnerability, and an inexplicable trust in the world around them. Minutes passed like hours as Coda watched. Maya had somehow positioned herself in the center of the 3 cubs, her small arms wrapped around the smallest one, while the other 2 nuzzled against her sides. They looked like siblings, these unlikely companions, united by something deeper than biology. Sarah's voice calling from the cabin broke the spell. "Maya? Maya, where are you?" The panic in her voice was unmistakable, and it sent a chill through the forest that even the animals could feel. Maya looked up from her play, recognizing her mother's voice but not understanding the fear behind it. Coda's muscles tensed. The human adult was approaching, and with her would come the chaos that humans always brought to the forest. She had to make a choice that would define not just this moment, but everything that followed. Her cubs looked up at her with trusting eyes, still clustered around the human baby who had become their playmate. In that instant, Coda made a decision that would shock everyone who learned of it. Instead of gathering her cubs and fleeing, instead of positioning herself defensively between her young and the human child, she stepped forward into the clearing. Her massive form emerged from the shadows like a force of nature, her amber eyes fixed not on Maya, but on the direction from which Sarah's voice had come. Maya looked up at Coda with the same fearless wonder she had shown the cubs. She reached out one small hand toward the enormous bear, making the same cooing sound that had first attracted the cubs. And incredibly, impossibly, Coda lowered her great head and allowed the human baby to touch her fur. The moment their skin and fur connected, something passed between them. Recognition, perhaps, or understanding. Maya's eyes widened with delight, and she clapped her hands together in the universal gesture of a happy baby. Coda's expression, if a bear could be said to have expressions, softened into something that looked remarkably like affection. Sarah's calls were getting closer, more desperate. "Maya, please, baby, where are you?" The mother's voice cracked with fear, and the sound of branches breaking underfoot announced her approach through the forest. Coda lifted her head, her sensitive ears tracking Sarah's movement through the trees. The mother bear's dilemma was clear in her posture. She could not let her cubs be discovered by an adult human, but she could not bring herself to take Maya away from them. The baby had become part of their group in a way that defied every natural law Coda understood. Maya, sensing the tension in the air, looked from Coda to her cubs, then back toward the sound of her mother's voice. For a moment, her lower lip trembled as if she might cry, torn between two worlds that had suddenly become real to her. Then Sarah burst into the clearing, and the world stopped breathing. Sarah's scream caught in her throat, transforming into a strangled whisper that barely disturbed the morning air. Before her, in a scene that her mind struggled to process, sat her 18-month-old daughter surrounded by 3 bear cubs, with their massive mother standing just feet away. The paintbrush she had been holding when she first noticed Maya's absence fell from her numb fingers, landing silently on the forest floor. Time fractured into a series of impossible moments. Maya looked up at her mother with bright, innocent eyes, completely unaware of the danger that Sarah perceived. The baby's tiny hand was still resting on Coda's enormous paw, a gesture so tender and trusting that it made Sarah's heart stop entirely. The bear cubs continued their gentle play around Maya, occasionally nuzzling against her with the affection typically reserved for their own siblings. Sarah's first instinct was to scream, to rush forward and snatch her daughter away from what every rational part of her mind identified as mortal danger. But something in the scene held her frozen. Coda's amber eyes met hers across the clearing, and instead of the aggressive challenge Sarah expected, she saw something that looked almost like understanding. The mother bear's posture was relaxed, protective but not threatening, as if she were a guardian rather than a predator. "Oh my God," Sarah breathed, her voice so quiet it barely registered as sound. "Maya, baby, don't move." But Maya, delighted to see her mother, clapped her hands together and pointed excitedly at her new friends. She babbled something in her private baby language, clearly trying to introduce Sarah to the cubs. The largest cub, the female with the white chest patch, looked up at Sarah with curious eyes, tilting her head in the same way Maya did when she encountered something new. Coda remained motionless, but Sarah could see the intelligence working behind those amber eyes. The bear was making calculations, assessing threats, deciding what to do about this human intrusion into what had become a peaceful scene. Sarah realized with growing amazement that Coda was not behaving like a wild animal protecting her young. She was behaving like a mother who had accepted another child into her family. "This is impossible," Sarah whispered to herself, her photographer's eye automatically cataloging details even as her mother's heart hammered against her ribs. Maya's clothes were clean, unmarked by any sign of struggle. The cubs showed no defensive posturing, no signs of stress or agitation. Even more remarkably, Coda's own demeanor suggested that this was not the first time such a scene had played out. The realization hit Sarah like a physical blow. Maya had been doing this before. Somehow, her daughter had been sneaking out to play with these bear cubs, and their mother had not only allowed it, but had been protecting Maya in the process. The baby's recent changes in behavior suddenly made sense, the way she had been sleeping more soundly, waking up with dirt under her fingernails that Sarah had attributed to playing in their small garden, the strange contentment that had settled over Maya in recent weeks. A stick cracked behind Sarah, and she spun around to see David emerging from the tree line, grocery bags still in his hands. His face went through the same series of expressions that Sarah's had: confusion, disbelief, and finally stunned acceptance of what he was seeing. "Sarah," he said carefully, his voice barely above a whisper, "tell me I'm hallucinating." "I wish you were," Sarah replied, not taking her eyes off the incredible tableau before them. "David, I think she's been coming out here regularly. Look at how comfortable she is with them." David set the grocery bags down with deliberate care, as if any sudden movement might shatter the delicate peace of the moment. His background in technology had trained him to analyze problems logically, But nothing in his experience had prepared him for this. He watched as Maya attempted to stand, using Koda's thick fur as support, while the bear remained perfectly still to help the baby find her balance. "The mother bear is helping her," David observed, his voice filled with wonder. "She's actually helping Maya stand up." As if responding to his words, Koda shifted slightly, positioning herself so that Maya could lean against her more comfortably. The cubs seemed to understand their mother's actions, creating a small circle around Maya that would prevent her from falling. It was a display of interspecies cooperation that belonged in scientific journals, not in their backyard forest. Maya, now standing with Koda's support, pointed at her parents and babbled excitedly. She was clearly trying to communicate something important, her small face serious with the effort of making herself understood. The cubs looked where Maya pointed, studying David and Sarah with the same careful curiosity they had shown Maya. "She's introducing us," Sarah realized, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "Maya is trying to introduce us to her friends." The smallest cub, bolder than his siblings, took a tentative step toward David. The cub's movement was cautious but friendly, the approach of a child meeting adults for the first time. David found himself slowly lowering into a crouch, instinctively making himself less intimidating to the small bear. "Hey there, little guy," David said softly, extending his hand palm up in the universal gesture of peaceful intention. "You're Maya's friend, aren't you?" The cub sniffed the air around David's hand, his tiny nose working to process this new scent. After a moment that felt like an eternity, the cub touched his nose to David's palm in what could only be described as a greeting. The contact lasted just seconds, but it fundamentally changed everything David thought he knew about the relationship between humans and wild animals. Koda watched this interaction with what appeared to be approval. Her ears were forward, alert but not aggressive, and her breathing remained steady and calm. She was, Sarah realized, evaluating David's character just as she had evaluated Maya's. The mother bear was determining whether these adult humans could be trusted with the safety of her cubs. "She's testing us," Sarah whispered to David. "She's trying to decide if we're safe." Maya, sensing the importance of the moment, reached out her other hand toward Sarah. The gesture was clear. She wanted her mother to join this impossible gathering. Sarah looked into her daughter's trusting eyes and saw something there that she had never noticed before. Maya had always been an unusually calm baby, but now Sarah could see that her daughter possessed an almost supernatural ability to read the intentions of others, whether human or animal. Taking a deep breath that felt like it might be her last, Sarah stepped forward into the clearing. Every instinct screamed at her to grab Maya and run, but a deeper wisdom held her back. This was not a situation that could be resolved through panic or force. This required trust in her daughter's judgment, trust in the incredible bond that had formed between Maya and these wild creatures, and trust in the mother bear whose amber eyes held depths of understanding that Sarah was only beginning to comprehend. As Sarah approached, the middle cub, the one who had been most reserved, suddenly perked up with interest. Unlike his siblings, this cub seemed to recognize something in Sarah that drew him forward. He approached her with the same careful curiosity he had shown Maya, his small paws making almost no sound on the forest floor. "Hello, sweetheart," Sarah said, her voice trembling with emotion. "You're beautiful, do you know that?" The cub responded to her gentle tone by sitting down directly in front of her, in the classic pose of a dog seeking attention. Without thinking, Sarah reached out and gently scratched behind his ears, the way she might pet a friendly dog. The cub's eyes closed in bliss, and he made a small sound of contentment that was part purr, part sigh. Maya clapped her hands in delight at seeing her mother interact with her forest friends. She babbled something that sounded like approval, bouncing slightly against Koda's steady support. The scene was so domestic, so natural, that for a moment Sarah forgot they were dealing with wild bears in the middle of a forest. But Koda had not forgotten. The mother bear's head suddenly snapped up, her ears swiveling toward a sound that only she could hear. Her entire posture changed in an instant, from relaxed guardian to alert protector. A low rumble emerged from her chest, not quite a growl, but a clear warning that something had changed. David and Sarah froze, following Koda's gaze toward the eastern edge of the clearing. At first, they heard nothing but the normal sounds of the forest. Then, gradually, they became aware of voices carrying through the trees. Human voices getting closer. "Oh no," David whispered. "The hiking group." Sarah's blood turned to ice. Every Saturday morning, a group of hikers from town used the trail that passed within 100 yards of this clearing. She had completely forgotten about them in the shock of discovering Maya with the bears. If the hikers stumbled upon this scene, the result would be catastrophic. They would see only a dangerous situation, wild bears threatening a human family, and would react accordingly. Koda's rumble grew deeper, more insistent. She was clearly torn between her protective instincts toward both her cubs and Maya, and her need to get her family away from approaching humans who might not understand the delicate situation. The mother bear looked from Maya to her cubs, then toward the approaching voices, her massive head turning as she calculated their options. Maya seemed to sense the tension that had suddenly filled the clearing. Her happy babbling stopped, and she looked up at Koda with confused eyes. The cubs, taking their cues from their mother, moved closer together, their playful demeanor replaced by nervous alertness. "We have to go," Sarah said urgently, reaching toward Maya, "right now." But as Sarah moved to pick up her daughter, Koda did something that stopped her cold. The mother bear positioned herself between Sarah and Maya, not aggressively but firmly. Her message was clear. Maya would not be taken until Koda decided it was safe. The voices were getting closer. Sarah could make out individual words now, the casual conversation of people enjoying a morning hike, completely unaware that they were approaching a situation that could change everything for the Chen family and the Bear family alike. "There's got to be wildlife around here somewhere," one voice said clearly. "My brother swears he saw bear tracks near this area last week." David and Sarah exchanged terrified glances. If these hikers were actively looking for bears, the discovery of Koda and her cubs would lead to calls to wildlife authorities, investigations, and possibly the relocation or destruction of the bear family that had become so important to Maya. Koda made her decision. In one fluid movement, she gently nudged Maya toward Sarah while simultaneously issuing a soft command to her cubs. The 3 small bears immediately moved to their mother's side, falling into formation with practiced efficiency. But instead of fleeing deeper into the forest as David and Sarah expected, Koda did something extraordinary. She looked directly at Sarah and made a sound that was unmistakably communicative, part grunt, part vocalization, entirely purposeful. Then she looked toward a thick stand of pine trees at the western edge of the clearing, back to Sarah, and repeated the sound. "She's telling us where to hide," Sarah breathed, understanding flooding through her. "She wants us to hide with them." The approaching voices were now less than 50 yards away, and getting closer with each passing second. There was no time for debate, no time for rational thought. David scooped up Maya while Sarah grabbed the forgotten grocery bags, and the entire group, 2 human adults, 1 human baby, 1 mother bear, and 3 bear cubs, melted into the shadows of the pine grove just as the first hikers entered the clearing. Hidden among the thick evergreen boughs, pressed close together in an impossible alliance, the 2 families waited. Maya, cradled in David's arms, remained perfectly quiet, as if she understood the importance of silence. The bear cubs huddled against their mother, their dark eyes watching the clearing through gaps in the pine needles. Through the green curtain of their hiding place, they could see 3 hikers examining the clearing where, moments before, Maya had been playing with the cubs. One of them, a woman with short gray hair, knelt down and pointed at something on the ground. "Look at this," she called to her companions. "These are definitely bear tracks, and they're fresh, really fresh." Another hiker, a tall man with a camera around his neck, began taking pictures of the tracks. "We should report this to the Park Service," he said. "If there are bears with cubs in this area, people need to know." Sarah felt her heart sink. If these tracks led to an investigation, if officials came looking for the bear family, everything would change. The magical bond between Maya and the cubs would be destroyed, and Coda would be forced to take her family far from the only home they had known. But as Sarah watched, something remarkable happened. Coda, still hidden among the pines, began to move with incredible stealth deeper into the grove. Her cubs followed silently, as if they had practiced this maneuver many times before. Within moments, the bear family had vanished into the forest, leaving no trace of their passage. Only Maya remained with her parents, but the baby's eyes were fixed on the direction where her forest friends had disappeared. Tears began to form in her dark eyes, and her lower lip trembled with the universal expression of a child who has lost something precious. The hikers spent another 10 minutes in the clearing, documenting the tracks and discussing what they had found. Finally, they packed up their cameras and continued on their way, their voices fading as they moved deeper into the forest. When silence returned to the clearing, David and Sarah emerged from their hiding place with Maya. The baby immediately began looking around for her missing friends, her small voice calling out in her private language. When no cubs appeared, Maya's cries grew more distressed, breaking her parents' hearts with their plaintive desperation. "They're gone, sweetheart," Sarah said softly, holding Maya close. "Your friends had to go away." But even as Sarah spoke those words, she felt the inadequacy of them. This was not just about childhood friends going away. This was about the destruction of something extraordinary, something that might never happen again in the history of human and animal relationships. Maya's cries echoed through the forest, a sound so full of loss and confusion that it seemed to pierce the very heart of the wilderness itself. Somewhere in the depths of the trees, 3 small bears heard those cries and felt their own confusion at the sudden separation from their human sister. And deeper still, in a place where the shadows grew thick and the ancient trees whispered secrets to each other, a mother bear stood with her head raised toward the sound of Maya's grief, her own heart heavy with a loss she could never have imagined feeling for a human child. The walk back to the cabin felt like a funeral procession. Maya's tears had subsided into hiccuping sobs, but her dark eyes continued to search the forest for any sign of her missing friends. She twisted in David's arms, reaching toward every shadow, every rustling branch, hoping to catch a glimpse of familiar fur or hear the soft grunts that had become the soundtrack of her secret adventures. Sarah walked beside them in stunned silence, her mind reeling from what they had witnessed. As an artist, she had always believed in the possibility of magic existing just beyond the edge of ordinary life. But nothing had prepared her for the reality of watching her daughter communicate with wild bears as if they shared a common language. The memory of Coda's amber eyes filled with what could only be called maternal affection for Maya would haunt her dreams for years to come. When they reached the cabin, David gently placed Maya in her high chair, while Sarah mechanically began unpacking the forgotten groceries. The normalcy of the domestic routine felt surreal after what they had experienced. Boxes of cereal and cans of soup seemed like artifacts from another world, one where babies didn't befriend bear cubs, and mother bears didn't protect human children. Maya refused her lunch, pushing away the carefully prepared organic baby food that had always been her favorite. Instead, she kept pointing toward the back door and making soft calling sounds, the same ones Sarah now realized she had been using to communicate with the cubs. The baby's distress was so palpable that Sarah found herself fighting back tears of her own. "We have to do something," Sarah said finally, her voice thick with emotion. "Look at her, David. She's heartbroken." David ran his hands through his hair, a gesture Sarah recognized as his way of processing impossible situations. "What can we do? Report it to someone? Tell them there's a mother bear in the forest who's adopted our daughter as part of her family? They'll think we're crazy, and then they'll come looking for Coda with tranquilizer guns." The mention of tranquilizer guns made Sarah's blood run cold. She had heard too many stories of problem bears being relocated or worse, destroyed when they showed too much interest in human habitation. The thought of Coda facing such a fate because of her extraordinary capacity for cross-species love was unbearable. Maya's crying intensified, and she began hitting the tray of her high chair with tiny fists. Her message was clear. She wanted to return to the forest, to her friends, to the family that had accepted her without question or fear. The sound of her distress filled the cabin like a physical presence, making it impossible for David and Sarah to think clearly. "Maybe?" Sarah began hesitantly, then stopped herself. "Maybe what?" David prompted. "Maybe we could take her back. Just for a few minutes. Just to see if they're still there." David stared at his wife as if she had suggested they teach Maya to juggle chainsaws. "Sarah, we're talking about wild bears. What happened out there was a miracle, but we can't count on miracles repeating themselves. What if Coda's protective instincts have changed? What if she sees us as a threat now?" But even as David spoke the words, he found himself remembering the way Coda had looked at him when the small cub had touched his palm. There had been evaluation in those amber eyes, but also a kind of welcome. The mother bear had been testing his character, and apparently he had passed some kind of ancient examination that had nothing to do with species and everything to do with the content of his heart. Maya's cries reached a crescendo that seemed to shake the very walls of the cabin. In desperation, Sarah picked up her daughter and carried her to the back window that overlooked the forest. The moment Maya saw the tree line, her crying stopped, replaced by hopeful babbling and excited pointing. "Look," Sarah whispered to David. "She knows they're out there somewhere." As if summoned by Maya's longing, a small movement caught Sarah's eye at the edge of the clearing behind their cabin. At first, she thought it might be a trick of light and shadow, but then she saw it clearly. The distinctive white chest patch of the largest cub, just visible through the undergrowth about 30 yards from their back door. "David," Sarah breathed, "look at the forest edge. 2 o'clock. David followed her gaze and felt his heart skip a beat. Not only was the white-chested cub visible, but her 2 brothers were there as well, partially concealed, but unmistakably present. They were watching the cabin with the same patient attention that house cats give to a bird feeder, waiting for something to happen. Maya saw them too, and let out a squeal of pure joy that seemed to carry across the distance between the cabin and the forest. The cub's ears perked up at the sound, and the boldest of them, the white-chested female, actually took a step toward the cabin before stopping, as if held back by invisible boundaries. "They came back," David said in amazement. "They actually came back for her. But where was Coda?" Sarah scanned the tree line for any sign of the mother bear, but the shadows revealed nothing. Either Coda was hidden too well to be seen, or she had left her cubs to make this approach on their own. The thought of the 3 young bears being alone sent a chill through Sarah's heart. Maya pressed her small hands against the window glass, her breath fogging the surface as she babbled urgently toward her forest friends. The cubs seemed to understand her frustration at being separated by the barrier of the house, and they began to pace back and forth at the forest edge, clearly agitated by their inability to reach their human sister. "We have to let her go to them," Sarah said suddenly. "I can't watch her suffer like this." "Sarah, no." David's voice was firm but gentle. "We don't know where Coda is. We don't know if it's safe." As if in answer to his concern, a massive shadow detached itself from the deeper forest behind the cubs. Coda emerged into the dappled sunlight with the silent grace of a creature perfectly adapted to her environment. But something about her posture was different now, more urgent, more purposeful than it had been during their earlier encounter. The mother bear surveyed the cabin with intelligent eyes, taking in the faces at the window, the distress of the human baby, and the answering distress of her own cubs. Then she did something that made Sarah gasp aloud. Coda approached the cabin. Not quickly, not aggressively, but with the deliberate pace of someone who has made a difficult decision and intends to see it through. She stopped about 10 feet from the back porch, well within the yard that David and Sarah had considered their private domain, and sat down. The message was unmistakable. Coda was not going to leave without Maya. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered. "She's not giving up. She's claiming Maya as one of her own." David felt a complex mixture of terror and awe wash over him. In all his research about bear behavior after their morning encounter, he had read that mother bears were fiercely protective of their young and would go to extraordinary lengths to keep their families together. But he had never imagined that protection might extend to a human child. Maya's excitement at seeing Coda was so intense that she began bouncing in Sarah's arms, reaching toward the window as if she could somehow pass through the glass. Her joyful babbling filled the cabin, and incredibly, Coda's ears perked up in response to the sound. The mother bear made a soft vocalizing sound, the same communicative grunt she had used in the forest clearing. Maya immediately quieted, as if listening intently to words only she could understand. Then, to her parents' amazement, Maya responded with her own series of sounds, not random baby babble, but purposeful vocalizations that seemed to follow the rhythm and pattern of Coda's communication. "They're talking to each other," David said in wonder. "They're actually having a conversation." The conversation continued for several minutes, with Coda occasionally tilting her great head as if considering Maya's responses. The cubs watched this exchange with patient attention, occasionally adding their own small sounds to the dialogue. It was a scene that belonged in the realm of fairy tales, yet it was happening in their backyard with a clarity that no amount of disbelief could diminish. Finally, Coda stood and made a more insistent sound, one that clearly carried the weight of command. Maya immediately began struggling in Sarah's arms, making it clear that she wanted to be put down. Wanted to go outside, wanted to rejoin her chosen family in the forest. "She wants us to bring Maya out," Sarah realized. "Coda is asking us to trust her with our daughter." The request hung in the air between them like a challenge to everything they thought they knew about parenting, about safety, about the fundamental boundaries between human and animal worlds. David looked at his wife, seeing his own internal struggle reflected in her eyes. How could they even consider putting their baby in proximity to a 400-pound wild bear? How could they not, when that bear had already proven herself to be Maya's protector? Maya's struggles grew more insistent, her small body language making it clear that she viewed the glass window as an arbitrary barrier preventing her from reaching her family. Her distress was so genuine, so heartbreaking, that Sarah found her resolve beginning to crumble. "What if we compromise?" she suggested hesitantly. "What if we take her outside but stay close?" We could sit on the porch steps and see what happens. David considered this for a long moment, his software engineer's mind trying to calculate risks and probabilities in a situation that defied all logical analysis. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Okay," he said, "but at the first sign of trouble, we grab Maya and run for the house." Sarah felt her heart hammering as she carried Maya toward the back door. This went against every parental instinct she possessed, yet something deeper than instinct was guiding her actions. Maya had shown them a world where love transcended species, where understanding could exist without language, where family could be defined by acceptance rather than biology. To deny Maya access to that world felt like a betrayal of something sacred. The back door opened with a soft creak that seemed unnaturally loud in the charged atmosphere of the moment. Coda's ears swiveled toward the sound, but she remained seated, patient as a monument carved from living stone. The cubs, however, could barely contain their excitement. They began making small whimpering sounds and taking tentative steps toward the cabin. Maya immediately reached toward Coda, her entire body language expressing joy and recognition. Sarah stepped carefully onto the porch, David close behind her, both parents ready to retreat at a moment's notice. "Hello, Coda," Sarah said softly, feeling slightly foolish for addressing a wild bear by name, but unable to think of any other way to acknowledge the relationship that had formed between them. "We brought Maya back to see you." Coda's response was immediate and surprising. She made a low, rumbling sound that was clearly welcoming, then slowly rose to her feet and approached the porch. But instead of focusing on Maya, Coda's attention was fixed on Sarah herself. The mother bear stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and looked up at Sarah with those remarkable amber eyes. For a moment that felt like eternity, the two mothers, one human, one bear, regarded each other with the mutual recognition of beings who shared the deepest responsibility of all, the protection and nurturing of young life. Then Coda did something that would change Sarah's understanding of animal intelligence forever. The bear reached out with one massive paw and gently touched the bottom step of the porch. Not aggressively, not territorially, but in a gesture that could only be interpreted as a request for permission. "She's asking if she can come closer," Sarah whispered in amazement. "She's asking for permission to approach Maya." David felt his worldview reshaping itself around this moment. Everything he thought he knew about wild animals, about predator-prey relationships, about the fundamental differences between human and animal behavior, was being rewritten by the sight of a bear requesting permission to interact with his daughter. Maya, sensing the importance of the moment, had grown quiet in Sarah's arms. She looked from Coda to her mother, then back to Coda, as if she too understood that this was a pivotal moment in all their lives. Sarah looked down at Coda's upturned face and saw not a wild predator, but a mother seeking approval from another mother. The recognition was so clear, so undeniable, that Sarah found herself nodding. "Yes," she said quietly, "you can come closer." Coda climbed the porch steps with careful grace, her massive form moving with surprising delicacy. When she reached the top, she positioned herself about 3 feet from Sarah and David, close enough to interact with Maya, but far enough away to avoid triggering their defensive instincts. Maya immediately leaned forward in her mother's arms, reaching for Coda with both hands. The bear lowered her great head, allowing Maya to touch her fur, to trace the distinctive scar on her shoulder that had given her the name by which the rangers knew her. The cubs, emboldened by their mother's acceptance onto the human territory of the porch, bounded up the steps with the enthusiasm of children who have been invited to a long-anticipated party. They clustered around Sarah and David's feet, looking up at Maya with adoring eyes, making soft sounds of greeting. What happened next would become the cornerstone memory of the Chen family for generations to come. Maya, still in her mother's arms but now within touching distance of her forest family, began to babble excitedly. But this wasn't the random vocalization of a typical toddler. Maya's sounds had structure, purpose, meaning. She was telling Koda and the cubs about her mourning, about being taken away from them, about her sadness at the separation. And incredibly, impossibly, they were listening with the focused attention of beings who understood every word. Koda responded with her own series of vocalizations, sounds that seemed to comfort Maya and reassure her that she had not been abandoned. The cubs added their own voices to the conversation, creating a symphony of interspecies communication that no scientist would have believed possible. But even as this miraculous reunion was taking place, dark clouds were gathering on the horizon, both literally and figuratively. The weather, which had been clear and bright all morning, was beginning to change. Storm clouds were building over the mountains, and the air carried the electric tension that precedes a significant weather event. More ominously, the sound of vehicles could be heard in the distance, coming up the mountain road that led into the Chen cabin. David's enhanced hearing, sharpened by years of listening for subtle audio cues in his technology work, picked up the distinctive sound of official vehicles, likely Park Service or wildlife management trucks. "Sarah," he said urgently, "we have company coming." The sound of the approaching vehicles had not escaped Koda's attention either. Her head snapped up, ears swiveling toward the road, and her entire posture shifted into high alert. She made a sharp sound to her cubs, who immediately moved to her sides in formation. Maya, sensing the sudden tension, looked around with confused eyes. She could feel the change in atmosphere even if she couldn't understand its source. The vehicles were getting closer, and with them came the possibility of an encounter that could destroy everything. If wildlife officials found Koda and her cubs in such close proximity to humans, the result would be swift and irreversible. The bear family would be captured, relocated, or worse. The extraordinary bond between Maya and the cubs would be severed forever. But Koda was not ready to give up without a fight. The mother bear looked at Sarah with eyes that conveyed a message as clear as spoken words. Protect what we have built together. In that moment, Sarah realized that they were about to face a test that would determine not just the fate of this remarkable relationship, but the very nature of what family could mean when love transcended the boundaries of species. The sound of engines grew louder, and David could now distinguish at least 2 vehicles making their way up the winding mountain road. His mind raced through possibilities. Park rangers responding to the hiker's report, wildlife management officials conducting routine patrols, or worst of all, a team specifically dispatched to deal with problem bears in the area. Koda's amber eyes locked with Sarah's, and in that gaze, Sarah saw something that made her breath catch. The mother bear wasn't just asking for protection, she was offering something in return. There was a depth of intelligence and emotion in those eyes that spoke of sacrifice, of a willingness to trust humans in a way that went against every survival instinct she possessed. Maya, completely oblivious to the approaching danger, continued her animated conversation with the cubs. She had somehow managed to work her way partially out of Sarah's arms and was now sitting on the porch floor, surrounded by her forest siblings. The smallest cub had positioned himself directly in front of Maya, as if he were her personal bodyguard, while the other 2 flanked her sides protectively. "They're protecting her," David observed with wonder, even as his anxiety about the approaching vehicles continued to mount. "Look at how they've positioned themselves around Maya." It was true. The cubs had unconsciously formed a defensive formation around Maya, their small bodies creating a barrier between her and any potential threat. Their behavior mirrored that of human children protecting a younger sibling. complete with the fierce determination that came from genuine love and attachment. The first vehicle crested the hill that led to their cabin, still about a quarter-mile away, but close enough that its occupants would be able to see the Chen property clearly. Sarah felt panic rising in her chest as she calculated how long it would take for the vehicles to reach them. "We have maybe 3 minutes," she said urgently to David. "What do we do?" Before David could answer, Coda made a decision that surprised them all. Instead of gathering her cubs and fleeing into the forest as any rational wild animal would do, she moved closer to Maya and the cubs, positioning herself in a way that clearly communicated her intention to stand her ground. The mother bear looked directly at Sarah and David, then made a series of soft vocalizations that seemed almost like instructions. Maya immediately perked up, responding with her own babbling sounds. Whatever communication was taking place between them, it was urgent and purposeful. Maya suddenly pushed herself up to her feet, using the smallest cub as support, and began walking toward the steps that led down from the porch. Her movement was more confident than David and Sarah had ever seen, as if her time with the bears had somehow accelerated her physical development. "Where is she going?" Sarah asked, moving to follow her daughter. But Coda intercepted Sarah with a gentle but firm nudge, clearly communicating that Maya should be allowed to continue whatever she was attempting. The mother bear's message was clear: trust Maya to know what she was doing. Maya reached the bottom of the porch steps and turned toward the forest. But instead of heading into the trees, she moved toward a large tool shed that David used for storing equipment and supplies. The shed was positioned in such a way that it would be invisible to anyone approaching from the road, hidden behind the cabin and partially concealed by a grove of mature pine trees. "She's showing us where to hide," David realized with amazement. "Maya knows about the shed." But how could Maya know about the tactical advantages of the shed's position? She was barely 18 months old, too young to understand concepts like concealment and strategic positioning. Yet she was leading them toward the one spot on their property that would provide complete protection from observation by the approaching vehicles. Coda and her cubs followed Maya toward the shed with the trust of beings who had absolute faith in her judgment. The sight of a mother bear and 3 cubs following the lead of a human toddler was so surreal that Sarah wondered if she might be dreaming. But the sound of engines growing ever closer was all too real, grounding her firmly in the extraordinary reality of their situation. The shed was larger than it appeared from a distance, originally built by the previous owners to house a workshop and storage area. David had been meaning to clean it out and convert it into a proper studio space for Sarah's art, but he had never found the time. Now, as they approached the weathered wooden structure, he was grateful for his procrastination. Maya reached the shed door and looked back at her parents expectantly. Her message was clear. This was where they needed to be. But when David tried the handle, he discovered that the door was locked, secured with a heavy padlock that he didn't remember installing. "I don't have the key," David said desperately, searching his pockets even though he knew it was futile. "I'm not even sure where it is." The sound of the vehicles was now close enough that they could hear the crunch of gravel under tires. In moments, the first truck would round the final curve and their cabin would come into view. If the officials saw Coda and her cubs anywhere on the property, the consequences would be swift and irreversible. But Maya wasn't finished with her surprises. The toddler walked to a small window at the side of the shed, one that David had always assumed was painted shut. Standing on her tiptoes with the determination of someone much older, Maya pushed against the window frame with both hands. To everyone's amazement, the window swung open easily, revealing that it had never been painted shut at all. Maya had somehow discovered this secret entrance during her previous adventures, adding another layer to the mystery of how much she truly knew about their property and its hidden possibilities. Coda immediately understood Maya's solution. The mother bear approached the window and carefully examined its size, calculating whether her cubs could fit through the opening. The window was large enough for the small bears, though it would be a tight squeeze for Coda herself. The cubs needed no encouragement. Following Maya's lead, they scrambled through the window with the agility of creatures born to navigate challenging terrain. Their small forms disappeared into the darkness of the shed's interior, followed immediately by Maya herself, who climbed through the opening with surprising ease. Coda hesitated for just a moment, her massive frame clearly too large for the window opening. But the sound of the first vehicle pulling into their driveway spurred her to action. With a grace that defied her size, the mother bear squeezed through the window opening, her thick fur compressing as she forced her way into the shed. Sarah and David had no choice but to follow. They climbed through the window just as the first official vehicle came to a stop in front of their cabin, its occupants beginning to emerge with the purposeful movements of people conducting an investigation. Inside the shed, darkness provided cover, but it also created an intimacy that was both comforting and terrifying. Sarah found herself pressed close to Coda's warm bulk, feeling the steady rhythm of the bear's breathing and the powerful beating of her heart. The cubs had clustered around Maya, who sat on an old tarp with the contentment of someone who was exactly where she belonged. Through a crack in the shed's weathered boards, David could see two uniformed officials approaching their cabin. One was a park ranger he recognized from previous encounters, Janet Morrison, a woman in her 50s who had always been friendly during their occasional interactions. The other was someone David didn't recognize, a younger man wearing the distinctive uniform of the State Wildlife Management Division. "Mr. and Mrs. Chen?" Janet called out as she knocked on the front door of the cabin. "This is Park Ranger Morrison. We'd like to speak with you about some reports we've received." David felt his heart sink. The reports could only be from the hikers who had discovered the bear tracks that morning. Now officials were here to investigate, and they had brought backup from wildlife management. The situation was even more serious than he had feared. When no one answered the front door, the officials walked around to the back of the cabin, their movements systematic and thorough. David held his breath as they passed within 20 feet of the shed, knowing that discovery would mean the end of everything they had witnessed. "Looks like nobody's home," the wildlife officer said, his voice carrying clearly through the still air. "But I want to check the area for recent bear sign. The hikers were pretty specific about what they saw." Sarah felt Coda tense beside her, the mother bear's protective instincts triggered by the proximity of potential threats. But instead of the aggressive response that might be expected from a cornered wild animal, Coda remained perfectly still, as if she understood that silence was their only defense. Maya, surrounded by her bear siblings in the darkness of the shed, had grown quiet as well. Even at her young age, she seemed to sense the importance of remaining hidden. The cubs pressed close to her, their warm bodies providing comfort and security in the uncertain situation. "Here," Janet's voice came from directly outside the shed. "Fresh tracks, and they're recent. Very recent." David's blood ran cold as he realized the officials were examining the very tracks that Coda and her cubs had left while approaching the cabin earlier. The evidence was undeniable. Bears had been on the Chen property within the last few hours. "These tracks show a mother and 3 cubs," the wildlife officer said, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "And they lead right up to the house. This is exactly the kind of situation we need to prevent. Bears that lose their fear of humans become dangerous bears." The irony of the statement was almost overwhelming. Coda hadn't lost her fear of humans. She had gained something far more complex and nuanced: understanding, respect, and love. But David knew that no official would ever accept such an explanation. In their world, bears that approached human habitation were problems to be solved, not miraculous examples of interspecies connection. We need to track these bears and assess the situation, the wildlife officer continued. If they're showing this level of comfort around human property, we may need to consider relocation or other management options. The euphemism chilled David to the bone. Other management options was official language for destruction. The final solution when bears were deemed too dangerous or too habituated to humans to be safely relocated. Through the crack in the shed wall, David watched as the two officials began following the tracks that led from the cabin toward the forest. Their movements were professional and methodical, the practiced routine of people who had conducted such investigations many times before. But as they tracked Coda's path from the cabin, something unexpected happened. The tracks seemed to vanish at the edge of the forest, disappearing into the undergrowth with no clear continuation. The officials spent several minutes searching for the trail's continuation, growing increasingly puzzled by the apparent dead end. "That's strange," Janet said, kneeling down to examine the ground more closely. "It's like they just disappeared into thin air." What the officials didn't know, and couldn't have guessed, was that Coda possessed an intimate knowledge of their territory that went far beyond simple familiarity. The mother bear had spent years learning every trick of concealment, every method of moving through the forest without leaving a trace. When she needed to hide her family's passage, she could do so with an expertise that would confound even experienced trackers. The wildlife officer stood up, brushing dirt from his knees with evident frustration. "We'll need to expand our search area. Bears don't just vanish, especially not a mother with cubs. They're around here somewhere." "What about the homeowners?" Janet asked. "Shouldn't we wait for them to return and get their account of what happened?" "We'll come back later," the wildlife officer replied. "Right now, I want to focus on locating these bears before they become a bigger problem. A mother bear that comfortable around human habitation is a serious safety concern." David wanted to shout that Coda was no threat, that she had shown more care and protection for Maya than many humans would have displayed. But he remained silent, knowing that the truth would sound like the ravings of someone who had spent too much time in isolation. The officials spent another hour searching the area around the cabin, their investigation growing more thorough and more concerning with each passing minute. They photographed tracks, measured paw prints, and collected samples that David suspected would be used to identify the specific bears if they were ever captured. Finally, as the storm clouds that had been gathering all morning began to release their first drops of rain, the officials returned to their vehicles. But their departure felt more like a reprieve than a resolution. David knew they would be back, probably with additional personnel and equipment designed specifically for capturing bears. "We'll return tomorrow with a full tracking team," the wildlife officer told Janet as they prepared to leave. "If there's a habituated bear family in this area, we need to deal with it before someone gets hurt." The sound of the vehicles driving away should have been cause for celebration, but David felt only a deep sense of foreboding. They had won this round, but the war was far from over. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new threats to the extraordinary bond that had formed between their daughter and the bear family. As the rain began to fall more steadily, pattering against the roof of the shed with increasing intensity, the strange group remained huddled together in their temporary refuge. Maya had fallen asleep against Coda's warm side, her small form rising and falling with the rhythm of peaceful slumber. The cubs, too, had settled into comfortable positions around their human sister, creating a living nest of fur and warmth. Sarah looked at this impossible scene. Her daughter sleeping peacefully in the protective embrace of a wild bear family, and felt her understanding of the world fundamentally shift. Everything she had been taught about the boundaries between human and animal, about the fundamental incompatibility of wild and domestic life, was being rewritten by the sight of her child finding perfect security in the company of creatures that should have been her greatest threat. But even as she marveled at the beauty of what she was witnessing, Sarah couldn't shake the knowledge that time was running out. The officials would return, and when they did, they would be better prepared and more determined. The window of opportunity for preserving this miraculous relationship was closing rapidly. Coda, as if sensing Sarah's troubled thoughts, lifted her great head and looked directly at her with those remarkable amber eyes. In that gaze, Sarah saw not just intelligence and emotion, but a kind of ancient wisdom that spoke of solutions beyond human understanding. The mother bear was planning something, and whatever it was, it would require a level of trust and cooperation that would test the very limits of what Sarah and David thought possible. As thunder rumbled overhead and rain drummed steadily against the shed's roof, the two families settled in to wait out both the storm and the uncertain future that lay ahead. But even in the darkness and uncertainty, Maya's peaceful breathing reminded them all of what they were fighting to protect. A love so pure and transcendent that it had bridged the gap between species and created something entirely new in the world. The question was whether that love would be strong enough to survive what was coming. As the storm raged through the night, something extraordinary began to unfold in the cramped confines of the shed. Maya, still sleeping peacefully against Coda's side, began to make soft sounds in her dreams. But these weren't the typical babbling noises of a sleeping baby. They were the same rhythmic vocalizations she had been using to communicate with the bears, as if even in sleep she was maintaining her connection to her forest family. Coda responded with equally soft sounds, a gentle rumbling that seemed to comfort not just Maya, but her own cubs as well. Sarah and David, pressed close in the darkness, realized they were witnessing something that went beyond simple communication. This was a lullaby, a bear mother singing her human child to sleep with sounds that transcended language and spoke directly to the heart. The rain continued through the night, washing away the tracks and scent trails that the officials had been so carefully documenting. By morning, nature itself had conspired to protect the secret that bound these two families together. When David peered through the crack in the shed wall at dawn, he saw that the storm had transformed their property into something clean and new, as if the slate had been wiped clear for a fresh beginning. But Coda was already stirring, her internal clock telling her that it was time to make the decision she had been contemplating throughout the long night. The mother bear gently nuzzled Maya awake, then looked at Sarah and David with eyes that held both sadness and determination. Maya awakened with a smile, immediately reaching for her bear siblings, who had remained clustered around her throughout the night. The cubs responded with gentle nuzzling and soft sounds of greeting, but there was something different in their behavior this morning. Even they seemed to sense that this moment carried the weight of farewell. Coda stood slowly in the confined space of the shed, then moved to the window they had entered through the night before. But instead of preparing to leave, she turned back to Maya and made a series of vocalizations that were clearly meaningful, though their exact content remained a mystery to the human adults. Maya listened intently, her small face serious with concentration. When Coda finished speaking, Maya looked at her parents with an expression that seemed far too mature for her 18 months. She reached out her hands to both Sarah and David, pulling them closer in a gesture that felt like both an embrace and an introduction. Then Maya did something that left her parents speechless. She took Sarah's hand and placed it on Coda's massive paw, then took David's hand and did the same. The three hands, two human, one bear, rested together for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity. In that touch, Sarah felt something pass between them. Not just understanding, but a kind of covenant. Coda was entrusting them with something precious. Not just the memory of what had happened, but the responsibility to protect and preserve the love that had grown between their families. Coda then moved to each of her cubs in turn, nuzzling them gently and making soft sounds that clearly carried instructions. The cubs listened with the attention of children receiving important guidance from a beloved parent. When she finished, they each approached Maya for what could only be described as a formal goodbye. The largest cub, the female with the white chest patch, was the first to say farewell. She touched her nose to Maya's forehead in a gesture so tender that Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes. The middle cub followed, gently licking Maya's hand with the affection of a brother saying goodbye to a beloved sister. The smallest cub, who had been Maya's most constant companion, simply pressed close to her for a long moment, as if trying to memorize her scent and warmth. Maya understood what was happening with the clarity that children sometimes possess in moments of profound change. She didn't cry or protest. Instead, she spoke to each cub in turn, using the special sounds that had become their private language. Her words, whatever they meant, seemed to comfort the cubs and help them accept the necessity of this parting. Finally, Coda approached Maya one last time. The mother bear lowered her great head until she was eye level with the human child who had become her daughter in all but blood. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, amber eyes meeting dark ones in a connection that transcended species and touched something eternal. Then, Coda did something that would remain etched in Sarah and David's memories forever. The mother bear opened her mouth and made a sound, not a growl or a grunt, but something that sounded remarkably like a word. A single syllable that could have been Maya, spoken in the deep, rumbling voice of the forest itself. Maya's response was immediate and clear. "Mama," she said, her first truly articulated word, spoken not to her human parents, but to the bear who had claimed her as family. The word hung in the air like a blessing and a promise. In that moment, the boundaries between human and animal, between civilized and wild, dissolved completely. Love had created something new, a family defined not by biology but by choice, not by similarity but by acceptance. Coda touched her nose to Maya's cheek one final time, then turned toward the window. Her cubs followed, but not before each one looked back at Maya with eyes that promised this was not really goodbye but simply until we meet again. As the bear family prepared to leave through the window, Coda paused and looked back at Sarah and David. Her message was unmistakable. Take care of our daughter. Love her as we have loved her. Remember what you have witnessed here. One by one, the bears slipped through the window and disappeared into the morning forest. But they didn't vanish entirely. From somewhere in the trees came a final sound, Coda's voice calling back to Maya, a sound that carried love and promise and the assurance that some bonds can never truly be broken. Maya crawled to the window and looked out toward the forest, her small hand pressed against the glass. She made her own sounds in response, soft vocalizations that seemed to carry across the distance between the shed and the trees. Then she turned to her parents with a smile that radiated contentment and peace. The officials returned that afternoon, just as they had promised. They brought tracking dogs and additional equipment, conducting an exhaustive search of the area around the Chen cabin. But the storm had washed away every trace of the bear family's presence, and despite hours of searching, they found nothing. "It's like they were never here," Janet Morrison said in frustration as the search team prepared to leave. "The tracks from yesterday have completely disappeared." The wildlife officer was equally baffled. "I've never seen anything like it. Bears don't just vanish without a trace, especially not a mother with cubs, but vanish they had, melting back into the deep forest with the skill of creatures who understood that survival sometimes required the ultimate sacrifice, giving up something precious to preserve something even more valuable." As the official vehicles drove away for the final time, David and Sarah sat on their back porch with Maya between them. The baby was playing contentedly with a pine cone she had found, but every few minutes she would look toward the forest and make soft sounds, as if maintaining a conversation that only she could hear. "Do you think we'll ever see them again?" Sarah asked quietly. David was about to answer when Maya suddenly perked up, her attention focused on something at the edge of the forest. There, barely visible in the shadows between the trees, 3 small shapes moved with familiar grace. The cubs had returned for one last glimpse of their human sister. Maya saw them too and waved enthusiastically, babbling in the special language that would always connect her to her forest family. The cubs remained only for a moment, long enough to see that Maya was safe and loved, then disappeared back into the wilderness that was their home. But their brief appearance left a gift behind. The knowledge that love this pure and transformative doesn't simply end when circumstances force a physical separation. It becomes part of who we are, part of the story we carry forward into the world. As the years passed, Maya grew into a child who possessed an extraordinary connection to the natural world. She could calm frightened animals with her presence, seemed to understand the language of birds, and displayed an intuitive knowledge of the forest that amazed everyone who met her. She never forgot her first family, the bears who had taught her that love knows no boundaries. And sometimes, on quiet mornings when the mist clung to the forest floor, Maya would sit on the back porch and make soft sounds toward the trees. From somewhere deep in the wilderness, if you listened very carefully, you could hear answering calls, the voices of a mother and her cubs who had never forgotten the human child who had become their daughter, their sister, their living proof that the impossible could become reality when hearts were open to love. The forest kept its secrets, and the Chen family kept theirs. But the story lived on in Maya's gentle way with animals, in Sarah's paintings that captured the wild spirit of the mountains, and in David's quiet certainty that the world was far more magical than most people dared to believe. Some bonds transcend the physical world, existing in a realm where species matters less than the capacity to love and be loved. Maya had learned this truth before she could walk properly, had lived it before she could speak in sentences, and would carry it with her for the rest of her life. In the end, that was Koda's greatest gift, not just the acceptance of a human child into a bear family, but the living proof that love is the universal language that connects all living things. Maya had been raised by 2 mothers, 2 families, 2 worlds that had found common ground in the simple recognition that some hearts are meant to beat in harmony, regardless of the bodies that contain them. The mountains stood eternal and unchanging, but they now held within their forests a story that would echo through generations, the tale of a human baby who grew with bear cubs, and what the mother bear did that was so shocking, so beautiful, so transformative that it redefined what family could mean when love was allowed to transcend every boundary that the world insisted must exist. And in the deepest part of the forest, where the ancient trees whispered secrets to each other, and the stream sang lullabies to the stones, a mother bear would sometimes pause in her daily routine and listen for sounds that might carry on the wind, the voice of a human daughter who would always be part of her heart, proof that some connections are written in the stars themselves and can never truly be broken.